Part 1. Values and Human Worth. Chapter 1. The Epidemic of Inferiority. He began his life with all the classic handicaps and disadvantages. His mother was a powerfully built, dominating woman who found it difficult to love anyone. She had been married 3 times, and her second husband divorced her because she beat him up regularly. The father of the child I'm describing was her 3rd husband. He died of a heart attack a few months before the child's birth. As a consequence, the mother had to work long hours from his earliest childhood. She gave him no affection, no love, no discipline, and no training during those early years. She even forbade him to call her at work. Other children had little to do with him, so he was alone most of the time. He was absolutely rejected from his earliest childhood. He was ugly and poor and untrained and unlovable. When he was 13 years old, a school psychologist commented that he probably didn't even know the meaning of the word love. During adolescence, the girls would have nothing to do with him, and he fought with the boys. Despite a high IQ, he failed academically and finally dropped out during his 3rd year of high school. He thought he might find acceptance in the Marine Corps. They reportedly built men, and he wanted to be one. But his problems went with him. The other Marines laughed at him and ridiculed him. He fought back, resisted authority, and was court-martialed and thrown out of the Corps with a dishonorable discharge. So there he was, a young man in his early 20s, absolutely friendless and shipwrecked. He was scrawny and small in stature. He had an adolescent squeak in his voice. He was balding. He had no talent, no skill, no sense of worthiness. He didn't even have a driver's license. Once again, he thought he would run from his problems, so he went to live in a foreign country. But he was rejected there, too. Nothing had changed. While there, he married a girl who, herself, had been an illegitimate child and brought her back to America with him. Soon, she began to develop the same contempt for him that everyone else displayed. She bore him 2 children, but he never enjoyed the status and respect that a father should have. His marriage continued to crumble. His wife demanded more and more things that he could not provide. Instead of being his ally against the bitter world, as he had hoped, she became his most vicious opponent. She could outfight him, and she learned to bully him. On one occasion, she locked him in the bathroom as punishment. Finally, she forced him to leave. He tried to make it on his own, but he was terribly lonely. After days of solitude, he went home and literally begged her to take him back. He surrendered all pride. He crawled. He accepted humiliation. He came on her terms. Despite his meager salary, he brought her $78 as a gift, asking her to take it and spend it any way she wished. But she laughed at him. She belittled his feeble attempts to supply the family's needs. She ridiculed his failure. She made fun of his sexual impotence in front of a friend. At one point, he fell on his knees and wept bitterly as the greater darkness of his private nightmare enveloped him. Finally, in silence, he pleaded no more. No one wanted him. No one had ever wanted him. He was a most rejected man. His ego lay shattered in dust. The next day, he was a strangely different man. He arose, went to the garage, and took down a rifle he had hidden there. He carried it with him to his newly acquired job at a book storage building. And from a window on the 6th floor of that building, shortly after noon, November 22nd, 1963, he sent 2 shells crashing into the head of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald, the rejected, unlovable failure, killed the man who, more than any other, embodied all the success, beauty, wealth, and family affection he himself lacked. In firing that rifle, he utilized the one skill he had learned in his entire miserable lifetime. Who am I? Who cares? Oswald's personal problems do not excuse his violent behavior, and I would not absolve him of his responsibility. Yet an understanding of his inner torment and confusion helps us see him not only as a vicious assassin, but also as the pitiful, broken man. Every day of his life, from the lonely days of childhood to the televised moment of his spectacular death, Oswald experienced the crushing awareness of his own inferiority. Finally, as it often does, his grief turned to anger. The greater tragedy is that Lee Harvey Oswald's plight is not unusual in America today. While others may respond less aggressively, this same consuming awareness of inadequacy can be seen in every avenue of life, in every neighborhood, in every church, and on the campuses of America's schools. It is particularly true of today's adolescents. I have observed that the vast majority of those between 12 and 20 years of age are disappointed with who they are and what they represent. In a world that worships superstars, they look in the mirror for signs of greatness and see only a terminal case of acne. Most of these discouraged young people will not admit how they feel because it hurts to acknowledge these inner thoughts. On our Focus on the Family radio program, several audience members have revealed deep-seated memories of inferiority. Woman. In grammar school, I was made to feel very uncomfortable by the fact that I was intelligent. By the time I graduated, I had really determined that being smart was a very big disadvantage because I was set apart from everyone else. Man. During the Depression years, a friend of ours brought some clothes over to our house because we had nothing to wear. My dad was so irate because they brought these things over. He made me gather them all up and take them back to his house. I felt very bad about it and very insecure because he felt he had to take these things away from me. Woman. I was always the tallest in my class. In 5th grade, they used to measure us once a month, and I was even taller than all the boys. When I came to dance, I had no one to dance with because they were all at my chin level. Woman. I had the opposite problem. I was always the smallest, and I looked so young. I can remember my freshman year in college. I went home and went to the fair. We went up to a booth where they would guess your age, and he guessed me as 14. Everyone thought that was so hilarious. These inferiority feelings are quite common among children and adolescents. Almost everyone can remember some similar crisis of confidence. As early as age 3 or 4, we begin to ask basic self-worth questions. Who am I? Who needs me? Who cares about me? Will I be accepted? Will people laugh at me? Will I be able to compete with others? Do I have a place in this world? Does anybody love me? And every child begins gathering evidence to answer these questions. Each failure, each mistake, each time he speaks out of turn, each time she is not invited to a party or picked for a team, each time he is called a name, this all gets stored in the memory bank. When the child steamrolls into adolescence, all of this comes back with a volcanic force to attack his or her sense of self-worth. I remember reading about a farmer who found a beautiful eagle down by the lake on his property. One of its legs had been caught in a steel trap. Despite that weight and its pain, the bird had flown many miles, but now it was exhausted. Low self-esteem is like that. You can fly with it for a while, but it weighs you down. And unless you or someone else can find a way to deal with it, to remove that trap, it will ground you and possibly lead to your destruction. Sadly, the high incidence of teen suicide may relate largely to a lack of confidence. Oswald never published his early self-doubts and loneliness, nor would we have paid much attention if he had. But in retrospect, there was little doubt that the overwhelming rejection of his early childhood led to deep discontent as a teenager, to his twisted adult life, and to his dark destiny. Not everyone who suffers through a bad childhood becomes an assassin, although it is sobering to consider the published case studies of Gary Gilmore, David Berkowitz, and Ted Bundy. Yet the consequences of low self-esteem can be grim for others as well. We need to start early in preparing our children for the many onslaughts they will face. You see, every stage of life poses its own unique threats to confidence. As I mentioned, little children face substantial fears about their status and identity, and teenagers must deal with a whirlwind of threatening change. Many adults also struggle with the legacy of inferiority feelings. I am also convinced that senility and mental deterioration at the latter end of life often result from the growing awareness by the aged that they live in the exclusive world of the young. Their wrinkles, backaches, and dentures are scorned. Their ideas are out of date. Their continued existence is a burden. This feeling of uselessness is the special reward that we reserve for life's survivors, and it should not be surprising that the elderly often disconnect intellectually. Thus, if inadequacy and inferiority are so universally prevalent at all ages of life, we must ask ourselves why. Why can't our children grow up accepting themselves as they are? Why do so many feel unloved and unlovable? Why are our homes and schools more likely to produce despair and self-hatred than quiet confidence and respect? Why should each child have to bump his head on the same old rock? These questions are of major significance to every parent who would shield his child from the pain of self-hatred. False values, true worth. The current epidemic of self-doubt has resulted from a totally unjust and unnecessary system of evaluating human worth. This system is prevalent in our society. Not everyone is deemed worthy. Not everyone is accepted. Instead, we reserve our praise and admiration for a select few who have been blessed from birth with the characteristics we value most highly. It is a vicious system, and we as parents must counterbalance its impact. This book is dedicated to the proposition that all children are created worthy and must be given the right to personal respect and dignity. It can be done. In order to help parents understand what their children are facing, Part 1 will analyze the false values on which self-esteem so often depends in our culture. I hope the reader will see how effectively and how often unknowingly we teach our small children that worthiness and social approval are beyond their reach. By glorifying idealized models to which few can conform, we have created a vast army of have-nots, born losers, who are discouraged with life before it has really begun. Like Lee Harvey Oswald, they turn this way and that, searching vainly for a solution to the inner emptiness and pain. For the millions who never find it, the road to personal worth becomes a long, unpaved detour leading nowhere. The matter of personal worth is not only the concern of those who lack it. In a real sense, the health of an entire society depends on the ease with which its individual members can gain personal acceptance. Thus, whenever the keys to self-worth are seemingly out of reach for a large percentage of the people, as in Western society at the turn of the 21st century, then widespread mental illness, neuroticism, hatred, alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, and social disorder will certainly occur. Personal worth is not something human beings are free to take or leave. We must have it, and when it is unattainable, everybody suffers. Of course, the root cause of all human suffering is sin in individuals and in the human family. It is often expressed in social forces that devalue human worth and make life miserable for the most vulnerable among us. But I have not written this book merely to discuss our problems or even to criticize the society that creates them. Rather, I propose a better way. By a proper use of parental influence and direction, we can provide our children with the inner strength necessary to survive the obstacles they will face. We can open the road to self-esteem and personal worth. Perhaps we won't reconstruct the world, but we can certainly help our children cope with it more successfully. The heart of this book, Part 2, is devoted to a description of 10 comprehensive strategies for building self-esteem, each one focusing on a particular area of concern. These discussions offer specific answers and recommendations regarding the common threats to personal worth surrounding our children. Some of the topics included are strategies for the early years, building an esteemed child environment at home, conveying respect as well as love, combating routine panic and parental fatigue, confronting sibling rivalry and a child's feeling that parental love must be won, dealing with the false ideals modern life puts before young eyes, instilling positive self-attitudes early. Strategies for middle childhood, helping your child compensate for weaknesses by working on strengths, preparing your child to compete in a competitive world, shaping the will without breaking the spirit, reducing educational threats to esteem, instilling independence and responsibility, teaching a child to be sensitive to others. Strategies for adolescence. Preparing a child for adolescence, meeting adolescent feelings of rejection, building healthy sexual attitudes, easing the process of breaking away. Strategies for adulthood. Identifying sources of depression, confronting deep-seated feelings of inferiority, therapeutic giving to others. Following the discussion of these strategies, Part 3, Chapter 9, is a concise explanation of patterns of human behavior. It describes the strategies or patterns used by both children and adults in fighting the values wars. This chapter is recommended to one who wants to comprehend the meaning behind the behavior of a child or spouse, a neighbor, or even of oneself. It is followed in Chapter 10 by some final comments and observations about the source for true values and human worth. Before we can resolve the problems confronting our children, however, we must understand the predicament they face. Let's move back, then, into the world of the young, examining the destructive value system taught so effectively throughout the formative years of life. Parents and teachers can contribute greatly to the self-respect of the next generation if they can genuinely empathize with little people, seeing what they see, hearing what they hear, and feeling what they feel.